Will it record?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. And over to you for the session.
All right, thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen. All right. I will surely. Okay. Is everybody?
Yes, it's working. Go ahead.
All right. Good. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. It's quite a challenge for me to cover the complete aspects of this topic. I've tried to kind of highlight with a few slides what I think about this and what I've learned about this, but also what the scientific literature tells about this, and also the scientific business literature tries to qualify and quantify this topic. So I've chopped it up in 4 parts. I will start with explaining the basic problem, because if we don't understand the basic problem, we also don't know how to solve it. So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with the pharmaceutical industry and specifically the R&D side, I will point out what we currently are still considering as the innovation gap in pharmaceutical R&D. Then I will try to kind of go into the causes and correlations, talk about, that was the original idea, of course, talk about the decision-making process and the R&D organization, and also give a few possible solutions. And then most important, of course, for this group, this very diverse group, is to kind of have a joint discussion about this. I was inspired by this when I was asked some years ago to write a book chapter on translational science and biomarkers, and I could have done this very technically, and then most of the topics in the book are very technical, but I was very much thinking about my own learning towards where I was on the other aspects than just the technologies to successes and failures of translational science and biomarkers. So I wrote a book chapter and started reading a lot about decision making and about the science of decision making. But let's first go to the innovation gap. So this is the most updated slide that I have. This is from Nature Review, just drug discovery article from 2024, and looks at the 2020 through FDA approvals from biologics to small molecules. And what you hopefully can see here is that there's quite some variability throughout the last 20 years. But it doesn't look very promising. It doesn't look like we are overcoming a productivity gap. So productivity is measured by the outputs of approvals first in class. You can see that we don't really seem to succeed to increase this significantly over the last 20 years. And if you're looking at other ways to measure clinical trial success rates, which lead to eventually an approval, and you're looking at the clinical success rates overall, you can see there are large differences between the therapeutic areas. But you can also see, for instance, that in oncology, which most competitive area at the moment, the success rates are very low. And if you're then looking on the right-hand side on the table, you can see that the success rates obviously are changing from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 2 to phase 3, and phase 3 to approval. But then again, in oncology overall, it's the lowest probability of success. Yet most companies are very active in this field, and I have a slide on that later on. The problem is not just the output, the problem is also the R&D spending. And if you're looking at the R&D spending, pharma is not one of the biggest investors per se in an absolute number. You can see, and this is a slide from a few years ago, Amazon is investing the most in R&D. But if you're looking at the R&D spending as the percentage of revenue, you will see very quickly that this looks very different. And again, this is a slide that's a few years old, so there might have been some shifts here, but you can see here that Merck & Company is at the moment one of the bigger investors in pharmaceutical R&D. So there's a significant amount of money on the revenue going into the R&D. So there are several ways to look at this flattened output. There's a way to look at it, and this is an article by Smetana from McKinsey, who has post the vintage index, and the vintage index actually tells you something about the investment that you made in the previous 7 years and the 7 years of revenue that follow an innovative launch. And again, interesting, what you can see here is that over the years, this vintage index shows that it's going down. So it means that we are getting less out of our investments. And again, this is different from the different therapeutic areas that you're looking at. Interestingly, anti-infectives, it seems to go up, as you can see here by the green line, and some of the other areas kind of stay flat. There are many ways to calculate output and input. And since our projects in R&D take 10, 14 years to come to success, it's often very difficult to kind of exactly calculate how much was invested and how much actually gain there is. That's also why generally people are not looking at the cost per drug and calculating the R&D investments per drug, but they're looking at the overall R&D investments. Also, the costs of failure, and the failures, as you can see, for instance, with the oncology drugs, is significant. Now, this is yet another way to look at it. And this article, which is very recent from Schumacher et al. In Drug Discovery Today, shows you that we have an estimated cost for the top 15 big pharma of about $6.7 billion per drug. And if you then calculate revenue and costs on R&D, and that's on the graph in figure 2, you can see that there's a number of companies, if they continue to invest more than actually ever get back, they are entering into a danger zone. So the analysis that we have just showed, and there are many other ones, and I don't have much time to go into detail, but this is the consensus. The output is not keeping up with the investments that are taking place in pharmaceutical R&D overall. And certainly by the top 20 big pharma, they generally have recognized this problem. And interestingly, a way to react to it is to actually to buy yourself into successes. And that's, of course, if you're looking at this graph, again, by Schumacher et al. From Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, if you're looking at how many drugs are actually coming out of the big pharma internally out of their own R&D, this is starting to be smaller than actually the things that they buy in. And this, of course, is what most of people who are active in R&D very clear. A lot of big companies are buying their way into successes by acquiring other companies, merging with them, acquiring them, or buying assets very early on and then developing them. Another reaction to the diminishing successes that we have in specific indication areas, and I have here one that is from Nature Reviews Drug Discovery in 2023, is what is called herding. And we see that specifically in oncology, where a particular target has surfaced, has shown clinical benefit, and then all the other companies are jumping on it to follow this target and to develop similar or different approaches to interact with the target. So why is it so hard to find new drugs? There are several reasons for that. In principle, most diseases are still very poorly understood. If you're looking at how they are being diagnosed, on what criteria, you will see very quickly that we actually don't understand diseases very well. And it's also what is called the blind man and the elephant problem, is that when we're looking at an elephant from a particular angle, from a particular expertise, we don't see the whole. And that is one of the aspects that we're seeing with trying to understand disease and trying to really understand diseases in the sense of finding novel therapeutic modalities and finding new cures. Another reason, of course, is what is called the better than the Beatles problem. If you're looking at this graph here from Scannell, you can see that the 1970s, a very successful period for drugs, and compared to 2010, a lot of things have changed. Of course, a lot of potential drug targets have already been exploited, so you're competing with already existing drugs. This is what's called a validated target space. you have to understand that the regulations have completely changed in the last 40 years. They have become much more restrictive. It's much harder to develop new drugs. And of course, as I said, there are good drugs available. Corticosteroids, for instance, are very good drugs with lots of side effects, but that's what you're competing against with regard to having efficacy or having clinical benefits. So the industry is facing a lot of problems at the same time. To understand to the point what I'm going to kind of address later on is with regard to the decision making, you have to understand a little bit how the industry has changed and how some of the things that we are witnessing currently is that there's a decreased productivity, what they may have been caused by, and how it is different than how we found drugs over the last decades. So if you're thinking about the pharmaceutics or the medicines that have been used up till 1847, it was mostly empirical. Herbs, plants, and minerals. That's how people use drugs and were able to kind of have some clinical benefit from as it says here, herbs, plants, and minerals. This started to change in the 19th century when pharmacology was established as a discipline, when there was the first chemical synthesis of a compound, and still empirical research in humans and animals. And in the 1970s, this completely changed with molecular biology and recombinant DNA technologies. This completely changed the way we were doing R&D in pharmaceutical companies, and also the way in which we discovered new drugs and tested new drugs. And it became an industrialized R&D, very different than many years before, and also very different in what was called the golden age of pharmaceutical R&D. So it's important to keep this in mind because you can almost calculate back that as of the start of the target-based drug discovery and drug development, we actually are getting ourselves more into problems. And if you're looking at this process that is currently most of you are familiar with, and the numbers are somewhat arbitrary, you can imagine that also looking at the success rates, that the way all the way from target discovery all the way to post-marketing activities is quite a cumbersome long road, can take up to 14 years, has a lot of risks. And in each of these steps, you can encounter problems which can either send you back or completely abolish your project. So this kind of gives you a way of looking into how we are doing it currently, and it's a little bit generic. There are many variations on the theme. It looks like a linear path, but of course there are many feedbacks loop in this. But this is in principle how we are doing pharmaceutical R&D in most, if not all, pharmaceutical companies, from small to big. And a number of these elements, of course, are again dictated by regulations. So there's not a lot of room for creativity in the path that we are currently following. But again, maybe for the discussion at the end, something where we can argue about how we can break out of this and come up with more innovative ways to develop drugs. It's also very complicated. I'm not going to take you through this table. It's a table from Wagner. John Wagner, an ex-colleague from Merck, clinical pharmacologist, and here he's describing the decision gates. And this slide is actually made to convince people how biomarkers could be into the decision gates and help us to overcome some of the problems. But to take a drug all the way from target discovery into clinical development and get an approval is quite a complex process, and this graph is still oversimplified to some extent. So I very briefly touched upon the innovation gap, and I will provide the slides with all the reference at the end where more detail is given about the deep analysis of this innovation gap and the current costs to develop a drug. But when we're thinking about the issues, many people have tried to understand what are now the root causes. Why are we not able to improve our output when there's so many technologies around and there's in principle science has evolved dramatically over the last 30, 40 years? So why are we not able to find more drugs, better drugs than we currently do? Let's look at an article which is already almost 10 years old. It made an attempt to look at the different factors and try to figure out if there was an impact positively or negatively on the output of drugs. And as you can see here, and they listed first the ones that would not really seem to impact it dramatically. It's kind of on a neutral level. The company R&D spend doesn't really seem to affect the overall output. The company headquarters location also, it's a European company or a United States or an American company, doesn't really seem to matter. So if you're going through this list from the top to bottom, you can see that all these factors don't really seem to influence. There is some differences with regard to the indication areas in which you develop drugs. That corresponds, of course, with what I showed you before. The success rates in oncology are relatively low. In hematological disorders, they can be a little bit better, and the cardiovascular is also a little bit better. But some areas are just very difficult to develop drugs in. And then looking at target families, transporters seem to be negatively impacted, and receptors and others seem to be kind of around the neutral level. Molecular properties also don't really seem to matter. Now, if you then start looking at the indicators, which are the indicators which I would call a little bit the softer side, the indicators of scientific acumen. So if a company does publish high impact in scientific journals, it seems to be that they are on the better side on science, and they therefore can also have a positive impact with regard to the output. Makes sense somehow intuitively, but by measuring it, it showed at least that that's the case. The other one, which is maybe also not fully surprising, but a very difficult to capture, is the better you are in making decisions as a company, the more likely it is that you will have a positive outcome with regard to more output as compared to the investments that you're making. And one thing that really jumps out, and for those of you who've worked in pharmaceutical R&D know how difficult it is, that is early termination of projects. That is really, so if companies are really good at early termination of projects and giving it to the benefit of the projects that can be successful, you have a tendency to become more successful as a company. Makes sense, but as I said, by the mathematics of measuring it, it was at least shown. So let's look at the decision making a little bit more in detail. How do we make decisions? And that's a bit of a thing where I've been investing a lot of time trying to understand over the last 25 years of my career is how do we make decisions in pharmaceutical companies, or how do I make decisions based on the information that I have? And most of you let's say in a very different context than drug discovery know that Donald Rumsfeld used this to justify the invasion in Iraq, meaning there are no knowns, the things that we are working with. There are known unknowns, the things that we know that we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. So we don't know that we don't know them. And if we're looking at the space of disease and treatments, this is what I currently would consider as known knowns. This is in the scale of what we know in a typical project. In a typical project in the pharmaceutical R&D space, depending on where you are, the known unknowns will always remain very large. And how relevant they are to solve your problem, you don't know. You also can't solve all the problems. It's the choices you have to make, the decisions you have to make, but they are significant. And we, of course, know with the complexity of disease and treatment that the unknown unknowns are huge. And since we don't know what they are, but we have to admit that they must be there, we just have to live with this. And this is a little bit the space in which we have to make decisions. And what is so special about the pharmaceutical R&D? Well, something that makes it very different than comparable industries is that we have very long project timelines, 10 to 15 years. It's a science-based industry with a high degree of uncertainty as opposed to engineering. It's very different if you develop a car with the engineering challenges. In the end, you will get a car. In the science-based industry in pharma, you never know if you get a drug. integration of very many different technologies. And I already told you this before with regard to the recombinant DNA technology coming from the 70s. These technologies actually, rather than solving a problem, may actually cause the problem because you need to integrate them. Because in the end, we want to find new drugs. We don't care about AI, recombinant DNA technology, or IT. They're all servants to finding new drugs. You have to just use them in the right way, but it's very difficult to integrate all these different technologies in the complexity of these 14 to 15-year projects. You also have an accumulation of knowledge and learnings over long periods of time, which is again a people problem, but also an information and IT problem. How do you collect all this information and knowledge, and how do you use that over so long time, but also in most bigger pharmaceutical companies with so many parallel projects? The regulatory compliance, already mentioned it to you. We have, of course, also ethical compliance, not just from drug discovery and drug development, but also on the marketing aspect. We have the complexity of disease and treatment, which I told you already before. If you're looking at how we diagnose diseases, and specifically other than in oncology, we know generally very little about the molecular aspects of the disease. It's very symptomological how we define diseases and how we diagnose them, making it very difficult when you're thinking about a target-based approach to combine these things. If you're thinking about diseases like depression and then enter it from a target-based approach where you are developing drugs based on maybe one or two receptors, you can imagine that by not really diagnosing the disease very properly, not even knowing what the differences is between two individuals with apparently the same disease, it's very difficult to develop new drugs. And then the scaling of R&D in growing organizations. I will touch upon that a little bit. You can imagine that it will be very different if you're in a startup company with 5 people sitting around the table trying to kind of move forward, as opposed to a company where there's 100,000 employees spread over the globe in different time zones. Lastly, market uncertainty. As we all know, even with the best products on the market, it's not always a given that the product sells very well. For a number of drugs, this has already been clearly shown, and this is an uncertainty that is being managed again in the portfolio management, but it's not always very easy to predict what the market will be like. Getting a little bit closer to the point of this presentation is, I've kind of summed up the problems, I have summed up possible root causes, and I have also summed up what the specific, and this is not an exhaustive list, what the specific problems are in the pharmaceutical R&D with regard to projects and project management. And what I've already mentioned to you before, and this has kind of continued since the 70s, we every 3-4 years we got a new technology that was supposed to solve our problem. When I think about the picture that I showed here, the idea at a certain time in the 80s was that with predicting structures and molecules that fit the structure, we would design molecules based on protein structure and then find new drugs very rapidly. At the time, this was kind of launched as a very quick way into finding many new drugs. It didn't turn out that way. For various reasons, but it's still very useful. It's still being used and it's getting better, but it's not a solution on its own. I myself was involved in sequencing some chromosomes of the human genome in the 90s. That's how I entered the industry, because the belief was at the beginning of the century that by having the whole genome sequence, we would have knowledge about all the genes, and then we would have all the targets, and then we would find all the drug targets and find new drugs. And it wasn't like that. It turned out that the number of genes that had been predicted in the beginning of the 90s, being up to 400,000, turned out only to be 23,000. So the complexity again in the genome was not in the number of genes, but lay somewhere else. And finding the genes was not a direct way into finding new drug targets. You look at it now with a bit of a surprise, but that's what we believed. And I think if you're looking at several technologies, and AI is one of the latest one, we tend to kind of looking at the bigger problem we're trying to solve, look at the next technology and try to integrate that as a way to kind of increase productivity. And so far, there has been none of these technologies and none of these new, let's say, specifically on a scientific level, game changers that has really changed the game for drug discovery and drug development. And to kind of stay on that level, we all know that we're looking at things, and this is what some of you may know, the Gartner hype cycle. They do this for all technologies. They produce this every year. One can debate about how useful this is. I think it tells you a little bit how the psychology of new technologies works. How do we look at new technologies and how we organizations are trying to fit them in? And there's an innovation trigger, there's a new technology coming, there's a peak of inflated expectations. We've seen it with the human genome around the beginning of the century. And then slowly there's a realization that it doesn't deliver the way it should deliver. And then there's the trough of disillusion. And then slowly, because these technologies are useful, if used in the proper way, then slowly they start actually to deliver, maybe not to the expected degree, but they start to deliver. And here you can see a little bit what that means for the life sciences, just as an example. So it becomes increasingly more challenging to handle projects with all these, what is often used as a selling argument. I hear that a lot. It's disruption. Someone once told me it's not very helpful if we think about healthcare to think about disruption. Of course, I know what it means, but I mean, disruption is not per se what we're looking for. I mean, we're simply looking for solutions. So there's more and more disruptive technologies that fit poorly into the existing structures. And what you're seeing companies are doing is that they react by reorganizations, by partnering, by blending novel technologies into the existing structures. But somehow these overall structures, and as I just showed you, the linear path of R&D, they don't really change. They stay kind of on the same, but on the side they're trying to kind of push in new technologies. So the question is, does that really work? All of these seem to fail mostly, and attention span, unfortunately, is very short. Generally, in the dynamics of companies and enthusiasm of including new technologies, you can see this maybe has an attention span of 3-4 years. But if it doesn't deliver, then it's again being considered as maybe not so useful, and then there's a divestment, and so on and so on. And again, 4 years against the 15 years project life is, of course, not comparable. So more data and information, I already mentioned that, more regulation, more possibilities that we have to think of how to include them, more pressure from the outside, ethical aspects, and not the least at the moment on a global scale, both in Europe and in the US, drug pricing. So let's go to the decision making. I'm looking at the time. I think I'm still okay with the number of slides. So when we're looking at how do we make decisions on the complexity that I just showed you. So I'm now talking about making decisions on the known knowns, and where we do realize with the uncertainty there are certain aspects which we didn't cover in our project. So there are certain aspects which you can't spend 5 years on your very early parts on your projects to figure out everything about the biology. So you have to make assumptions. You have to accept that you can't discover everything. So you have to move on. So as you are making decisions on every step with the information that you have, the known knowns and the known unknowns, there are a number of typical psychological aspects of as an organization and how we take decisions that are working negatively towards what I just was showing you, the output. So negative decisions. We generally don't like negative decisions. We, in projects and project teams, and also from a management perspective, we don't really like to stop projects. And if you remember, one of the clear correlations that was there with regard to successes, it was early decisions to stop. And this is probably one of the bigger problems in many, many companies, also where I've worked myself, to actually come to a conclusion, let's stop. Then there's the biases. When we're looking at the data, there is a cognitive biases, as we call them. There's the confirmation bias. We like to see the data that confirms our original hypothesis. We also anchor. We stick certain information to it that we believe is essential for making the decision. And there's also what we currently have as an availability to make a project continue. Groupthink is a very important one. For those of you who are familiar with the details of the explosion of the Challenger with the launch, this was the space shuttle that exploded some 20 years ago under very unfavorable circumstances. This has been analyzed in very detailed manner, and it turned out that when you put a number of experts together and make them decide together, there's also the group pressure. The reason why the Challenger exploded was that the ones that were responsible for the O-ring, which was cracking and therefore the booster rockets exploded, they were suppressed in their opinion to not launch by the rest of the team and by the management. Eventually, they gave the okay to launch and the Challenger exploded. And groupthink is a very big problem, I think, in the way that we work in a project organization where members are being pressured to move forward with regard to the data that's available. Project versus company goals. Per definition, projects have the aim to finish their project, but there is, of course, they fit into the overall company goals. And if you have 100 projects, it becomes very difficult to manage all these different individual project goals and fit them into a successful direction. And that's what I will address also later. This is what's called portfolio management. Translational complexity. So despite the huge advances in our ability to measure changes in genes, proteins, metabolites, is that we have difficulties in the part which is called the preclinical discovery and development to see what data is actually relevant for the human state and for the human disease rather than the mouse disease. So I always joke that we have become very successful in the pharmaceutical industry as to cure mice and rats from the disease, but less good with human disease. There's a high degree of data complexity, as you can imagine, with all the different functions. And if data starts to accumulate, which is still relevant to make your decisions, but you need a specialized insight to understand what these data really means and how that fits into the overall. And that's so much segmented that each individual has its particular expertise, but may not see the bigger part. It's again what I showed you before, the blind man and the elephant. It's very difficult to see that you're looking at an elephant if you're looking at the tail, that's your expertise. And there's the linear versus non-linear thinking. I already mentioned that to you before. Process look linear, but you have to kind of think in feedback loops to improve your project. Uncertainty, that's what I just mentioned to you before, the known unknowns. You have to work with that, and that makes the decision process sometimes very difficult, and to understand what your unknowns really are. A few other ones that I list here, decision delay, we procrastinate, we don't really want to take a decision, we keep projects alive. And again, many of you who work in pharmaceutical R&D are familiar with this. There's no real decision, but there's also not really an investment or a commitment anymore, but these projects are still alive. Overconfidence is an important one. The sunk cost fallacy is also a very important one. So once we have come to a conclusion that we might better stop a project, we are looking at how much we already have invested, and that becomes the driver to continue investing rather than stopping. And that, of course, in the end, looking at the success rates is a huge problem. Incomplete analysis speaks for itself. Decision fatigue. If there's many decisions to be taken by many different people, then over a short period of time, this can lead to decision fatigue, causing individuals to make impulsive, low-quality choices. They don't really look at the details anymore because there's too many things to take into account. Already mentioned to you this is typically an answer to not being able to cope with uncertainty. You just look what your competitors are doing, and you're following the trend because there must be successes in there. Everybody's working on it. Just going to take you very quickly through a number of case examples before I come to a conclusion. So this is an example of, and there are many examples like this, how R&D organizations react, but also how companies react. So this was actually prone for failure from the start because it was known that CETP inhibitors did not react in the same way in preclinical animal models as in a human, because already the pathway was very different. There was a number of companies that had tried to develop this, and Pfizer was one of the first, and in a big phase 3 trial failed. Roche, Merck, and Eli Lilly were all at the same time, or a little bit lagging behind, working on CETP inhibitors. But despite the translational limitations, the clinical failures, they thought that this target was still very attractive, and they kept on. All three of them failed, despite the fact that the data started to emerge why this concept just didn't work. And this has cost billions. And to some extent, this is what's happening in the Alzheimer's disease field at the moment as well, with the amyloid plaques as the central theme in disease and the antibody treatments. This is a positive example, not coincidentally out of a company where I've worked for, but this shows you a little bit how decision-making is influenced. So Organon started on the anti-PD-1 project in 2003. Organon was acquired by Schering-Plough, but Schering-Plough was not so much interested in this program, but left it on the side. Schering-Plough then was acquired by Merck & Company in 2009 for the programs that were listed here before, hepatitis C and BACE inhibitors. They didn't even know about all the projects that were still going on in the former Organon. Merck had a anti-PD-1 project, but had decided to shut it down because they didn't believe in it. They were listing the anti-PD-1 project of Organon as an out-licensing program, until coincidentally Bristol Myers Squibb published the first results with their anti-PD-1 antibody, and then Merck suddenly realized they had something in their hands which they didn't realize, and that's pembrolizumab. And pembrolizumab is one of the best-selling drugs, certainly in oncology at the moment, and also from a clinical benefit has revolutionized cancer treatment by by opening the immuno-oncology space. But you can see from the decision-making point of view, using the data that you have at hand and how you incorporate it, it's not always that clear, not so intuitively science-based. And this is what I mentioned to you before: aducanumab, and donanemab. These are both antibodies that have been used in Alzheimer's disease. The first one from Biogen is very controversial, was originally approved against the advice of the Pharma Advisory Committee because the clinical benefit was not seen, and the data was kind of massaged after a post hoc analysis in a subgroup of Alzheimer's disease patients. Eventually, it was approved and marketed, but Biogen has pulled it off the market. And as I hear, the current donanemab is also being reviewed again by the FDA if it has an actual benefit in Alzheimer's disease. I'm slowly getting to the end. I was talking about decision-making, how we are taking decisions, how difficult it is to take decisions, certainly in bigger organizations. But now let's look at the organizations themselves. Before the 1950s, pharmaceutical companies didn't really embark on fundamental research. That's very different these days. Today, pharmaceutical companies mostly have centralized R&D, whereas a corporation relies on decentralized, whereas large corporations depend on decentralized R&D organizations. So what you have to, and this is kind of from a corporate view, how organizations are built and how they grow, they are defined as having technical innovation, organizational innovation that you need. They are interdependent, and new forms of business organizations that can solve economical problems. And organization at institutional innovation is and institutional innovation is an evolutionary process. So in an organization, you have technological innovation, but you also need your organization to evolve to be able to cope with these technological innovations. The unprecedented technological advancement over the last decade urged most companies to rapidly evolve and adapt to the changing world. And I pointed that out already in the beginning. This for a lot of organizations, as they move forward, as new technologies come, but the organization exists, has its way of working, it's very difficult to introduce them. What did I want to say about this? Yeah, let's leave this for a moment. Older corporate structures and decision-making processes seem to limit progress and innovation. This again is the interplay between the people, the decision-making, but also how the organization is built. How do you allow people to work together, and how do they eventually come to decisions to move forward? How is that? Is that done hierarchically? Is this self-steering? And I think this is what I wanted to say with the before last point. I remember the CEO of Novartis saying 3-4 years ago that he did see the organization as a super tanker, difficult to move course, and that these innovative parts were kind of sailing around as speedboats, trying to kind of keep up with innovation. And I thought that was a very good way to, in an analogous way, to describe the difficulties with big organizations that have to change. I'll skip this one. R&D and size, and that's probably, if you remember in the slide that I showed you before, the R&D size on its own is probably not the real aspect of output and output of success. It's not completely true. There seems to be, of course, if you can see on the graph on the right-hand side from Schumacher, there seems to be, if you're looking at absolute output versus absolute R&D spending, there seems to be, of course, a relation between the size of the company and what you have as an output. If you're looking at the cumulative R&D spending versus the cumulative impact factor, you can see, of course, it correlates. So size does seem to matter. If you're looking at the, I'm going to finish up. If you're looking at the bottom slides, the bottom graphs, you can see that looking at this from different aspects, looking at the number of projects, it does seem that smaller companies are producing more projects, but it not necessarily means that they also generally are more successful. But there seems to be, at least again on the last slide, graph, some decrease in output in the top 25 firms. One thing that at least I want to say is, if you try to understand big companies, mid-sized companies versus small companies, and this idea that smaller companies are always successful, you have to realize this is also a bias that we have, because we're seeing the successes, but we forget about the 90% of the companies that actually never made it. So one has to be very careful comparing big companies with small companies in the sense of success rates. Very quickly, possible solutions, that's where I finish up, and that's for the Q&A. We have to think in a more integrative way. These technologies are often used independently, but they should, of course, be integrated. But that's, again, with the organization and the people, the challenge that you have. Something that's very clear, I always teach that in lectures that I give, is that we don't have this moment of Fleming of finding your new drug. We really need to work together. Everybody knows that there is a way that we have to, as in a matrix, work together. There have been new solutions posed, which is the unbossing, which means that leaders are no longer directing directions and making the decisions, but the decisions are made by the team, and the leaders are serving the decision making. That's a very interesting development. Let's see where this goes. And there's, of course, more mathematical ways, and I won't go into detail. As I said, I will provide the slides separately. There's different ways how we can cope with this uncertainty in the data that we have in a more intelligent way. it was coined actually by George Miller that the human brain can only work with 7 concepts. And that's where, for instance, I would see AI to come in, of working with an unlimited number of concepts and defining decisions that we with the human brain cannot make. A last remark here is, and we can debate about that a little bit in the Q&A, when you're looking at how organizations failed, like Kodak and Nokia, in keeping up with innovation and being surpassed by other companies, it was not that they didn't have the technology. Kodak had the first digital camera in 1975. And Nokia already had the technology in-house for the smartphone technology. But that's maybe for the Q&A to debate about what we can do better. That was it. That was my take up on organizations. I have to see the camera back on organizations and right.
Thank you very much, Peter. I literally loved your presentation because of the integration of human factors. A bunch of years before, I've been helping a company called Philip Morris to change their R&D. So I'm very sensitive to these human factors things. Well, but I don't want to speak about Philip Morris, not an example. If someone has a question, would he or she be so nice to raise the hand? And you know, you have a little button called raise normally.
Yeah.
And I should see you, and then you would turn on your camera and raise your question. Otherwise, I will maybe start with one. Have you seen large pharma company who deliberately started a cultural change efforts, claiming they do, I mean, officially saying, we want to be better at inventing new stuff, rather than doing it behind the lines, under the carpet, with a sort of shame? Is this happening?
Yeah, there have been a few, and as I mentioned in my last slide, you see that Bayer now has, Bill Anderson has said, we're going to do this completely different. We're going to cut out layers. We have teams more autonomous, more input, and this is more from the recent time. Also, of course, with Novartis. I remember from the beginning of the century, when this idea came up that the biotechs were more successful, that GSK tried also to revolutionize their R&D by having centers of excellence, which would compete with each other, which kind of mimics if you have 10 biotechs next to each other. They failed, and I don't think they failed because the idea was not good. It's just, again, I think it's the attention span. It's too short.
Clear. Yeah, it's difficult to change a culture. We have a question from Salman, who wrote it in the chat. How likely is it that companies from China and India could be able to make pharma R&D in a more effective way, or more efficient?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Salman, and I of course understand where it's coming from. I have to be very careful here. My first idea would, no, I don't believe in it, because I think there's at the moment not an easy quick fix for this problem. I think that's the first problem that most companies have with introducing a new technology, or assuming by looking at their neighbors they can do it better, that with a new idea like AI they can solve the problem. I don't think so. But I do believe that at some point in time there will be companies coming up that are not burdened by how they are built in the past, and that may be able to change things around. I'm skeptical but hopeful that companies that are wise, that are built on AI from A to Z, may have a better competitive advantage than companies who are trying to introduce it into their current culture. But if this is now coming out of India or China, looking at other technology areas, I doubt. I still do believe that the traditional companies have a lot of power, but somehow they are kind of stuck.
Understood. Do you think we could face a syndrome like, in some large companies, they will tend to say the consultants said, I mean, to outsource the decision because nobody wants to take the decision internally. Could this happen with AI? Like someone who would say, our AI said we should go this way.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and it's also what I said in one of my slides. And I do believe that AI can be used in better ways. I think there are ways that AI can be used more effectively. But of course, you can imagine that it would be very difficult to give a decision to a system rather than to a person. Is going to be very difficult. You know, if you tell Bill Anderson's now actually, you know, all these teams, but we fed it into an AI and they come to this decision. Will he or she that is at the top of the company actually take that? And in some cases, I think what we're seeing now with AI is tremendous what it can give, but we should also not overestimate, because I said before, AI can not work with the unknown unknowns, right?
Or maybe she will invent it at some point of time.
Yeah, but that's a bit, and then it becomes kind of yeah.
Scary. Do we have other questions in the room? I must confess, I don't. Oh, yeah, we have Salman who would like to raise a question.
Thank you, Peter, for an excellent presentation. I think it will need, in my brain, it will need more than just my brain. I think I need to resort to AI to really try and understand and digest everything that you have said. Thank you so much. I still want to challenge you a little bit,
Mhm.
and I'd like to see what the group thinks here. I wonder if we are overestimating the importance of AI. You've alluded to that a few times.
Mhm.
I'm hearing it a lot now. I've had, unfortunately, a couple of cases, sad cases, where AI today is being purposely misused when it comes,
Mhm.
for instance, to candidates presenting themselves. I leave it to AI, and AI will come up with a perfect solution. And very often it does. So, my question really to you, and a challenge really is as a scientist, are we perhaps not in danger of um, somehow subjugating our brain, our responsibilities, perhaps too much to AI?
I would very much also like to hear the other opinion. I guess this is maybe something for a drink with a face-to-face meeting. But my first is, and I think what I was trying to say is that if AI is used in a proper way by us as scientists or as organizations, it can be instrumental. But I don't think we should use AI as it has been proposed as a system that we will leave it to decide. I think. In drug discovery, AI can be very useful in the drug development space and in the medical space. I doubt also with the availability of the data. But again, if used in an appropriate way, it can. But there's also, as you said, plenty of examples where it didn't deliver. And if you're asking questions on ChatGPT now, it becomes very hallucinative experience on what you get as a response. So I guess we as human beings have to be very careful. But at the same time, also be open to new ways, which we may not fully understand. And that's a bit the trick with AI. It goes into a direction where we may not fully understand the outcome, and that feels uncomfortable.
Clear. We have a question from Marina. If you were to establish a new organization to invest in drug discovery in neurology, select targets, teams, etc., what would be the main factors? What would be the main factors you would account for when selecting projects? Well, that's a nasty question.
Oh, that's a difficult one. I've worked in Organon on antipsychotics and antidepressants, and know firsthand how difficult it is to develop. And I remember raising the hand to the chief scientific officer at the time of Schering-Plough when we were looking at new drug discovery programs, and I said, shouldn't we invest in a company more in finding better diagnosis for the disease and then develop new drugs rather than developing something that we don't really understand? And he stopped for a second and he said, Peter, you're right, but this doesn't fit into our organization. And I think if you're looking at an organization, but this is of course for the long term, you first a good disease understanding and maybe also investing in better disease diagnosis rather than thinking from your drug discovery, drug development. Again, I think you have to change the paradigm a little bit of how we are doing drug discovery and drug development. So I would build my organization slightly different there.
Understood. Thank you very much. Are we in position to take a last question, maybe? Is there anybody who would like to raise a last hand?
The slides will be...
Salman again.
Me again, yeah. I'm going to once again ask a bit of a challenging question, being the devil's advocate by nature. And I wonder if the traditional R&D that we are all used to, you're a great proponent, a great example of that, Peter. I really wonder if it is very much out of date. And I'm thinking of, especially of so-called emerging markets, markets coming up also in pharma and medtech. And I wonder if the real successful model for the future of a successful R&D lies more in frugality rather than the very expansive R&D organization that we're used to. This is a very kind of open question. I don't think we can find an answer today.
My last answer, or my last part to this seminar is, and I'm going to be again a bit provocative here. I think that the way that we are trying to solve the unmet medical need, which are clearly there, is not going to go through the way that we have built big pharmaceutical corporations, R&D, and then have universities sitting on the side, and we do in-licensing. And I think on a collective base, we have to do this completely different. That also means that big pharmaceutical companies may have to earn less, but the way that we are doing innovation cannot be in two separate camps. I mean, we have to realize that the science outside of pharmaceutical companies is vast, but somehow the combination between what we do in R&D and how we use this is not optimal. So I think next to changing company R&D structure, I think the way we want to find new drugs has to be completely rethought at a different level than corporations and universities. I guess this is more like a collective governmental, almost a global challenge. But this is, with a different head on than working in a pharmaceutical company.
Thank you very much, Peter. On behalf of the board of Basel Healthcare Dialogues, I would like to thank you very much for this contribution. I'm sure all the participants had a lot of fun listening to you, and I hope this will give us all courage to go back to our innovation and find the ways. And we wish you all a very nice afternoon and end of the week.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.